There is a mansion in St. Louis where four members of the same family ended their own lives across 45 years. The Lemp Mansion stands at 3,322 DeMenil Place, a 33-room palazzo wrapped in red brick and ornate stone, surrounded by gardens that once signaled arrival among America's industrial elite. When William J Lemp Sr. transformed this property in the 1870s, St. Louis was the brewing capital of America. The Lemp family fortune approached $10 million, equivalent to roughly $330 million today. Their brewery produced 500,000 barrels annually. Their name was known from Mississippi riverboats to New York hotels. The mansion would witness more than wealth. It would absorb a father's gunshot in his office. It would hear his son's suicide in the same room 18 years later. It would feel a brother's final bullet in the basement where he first shot his dog. Between those deaths, a daughter would take her life elsewhere, but the mansion's gravity pulled even that tragedy into its orbit. 4 suicides, 1 family, 1 building, and when the last Lemp pulled the trigger in 1949, the mansion that had cost a fortune sold at auction for $10,000. This is the story of the Lemp Mansion, where the American dream curdled into American Gothic, where Prohibition destroyed a dynasty, and where the walls still stand, bearing witness to the price of empire. Before we dive into one of America's darkest mansion stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by stories of American fortunes won and lost, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey into the lives of the gilded and the fallen. Chapter 1. The Cave City. In the 1840s, St. Louis was a river city built on a secret. Beneath the streets and foundations, beneath the warehouses that line the Mississippi, an extensive network of natural limestone caves twisted through the bedrock. The caves had existed for millennia, carved by underground streams that left behind chambers with year-round temperatures hovering near 50 degrees. For most of the city's early history, these subterranean spaces served as storage for traders and merchants seeking cool, dry conditions for their goods. German immigrants arriving in massive waves during the 1840s and 50s recognized something different in those caves. They saw the future of American beer. Traditional German lager required consistent cool temperatures during fermentation and aging, a process called lagering that gave the beer its clean, crisp character. In European breweries, ice cut from frozen lakes provided refrigeration. In St. Louis, where summers turned brutal and winters unpredictable, the natural cave system offered something better: constant temperature, unlimited capacity, free refrigeration that never melted. By the 1860s, St. Louis had become the brewing capital of the American frontier. Dozens of German brewers had established operations, using the caves to produce lager that competed with anything made in Munich or Cologne. The best breweries built directly above the largest cave systems, drilling down through bedrock to create vertical shafts that connected their facilities to natural refrigeration below. The neighborhood around Cherokee Street and DeMenil Place developed as one of the city's most fashionable districts, precisely because of its proximity to these brewing operations. Wealthy German families who had made fortunes in beer wanted homes that announced their success while remaining close to the industrial complexes that generated their wealth. The area combined urban sophistication with industrial convenience. Tree-lined streets above and limestone chambers below. In 1868, a modest businessman named Jacob Feickert constructed a residence at what would become 3,322 DeMenil Place. The house followed the Italian Renaissance Revival style popular among St. Louis's aspiring class. Red brick with stone trim, tall windows, decorative cornices. Feickert built well, but not lavishly. His was a solid middle-class home in a neighborhood transitioning upward. What Feickert could not have known was that his modest palazzo sat above one of the area's most extensive cave networks. Beneath his foundation, limestone chambers stretched in multiple directions, some connecting to even larger systems that ran under the entire industrial district. A person could walk underground from Feickert's property to brewery complexes blocks away, never seeing daylight. The empty house awaited. The fortune that would fill it was already being built, barrel by barrel in caves beneath the city streets. Chapter 2. The grocer's son who built an empire, Johann Wilhelm Lemp, was born February 20th, 1836, in Eschwege, a small town in the Kingdom of Westphalia that would eventually become part of Germany. His father was a grocer, his prospects ordinary. In 1838, when Johann was barely 2 years old, his family joined the tide of German immigrants flooding into America seeking economic opportunity that European class systems denied them. They settled in St. Louis, where Johann's father, Johann Adam Lemp, opened a small grocery store that sold provisions to the city's growing German population. Johann Adam died when William, as he Americanized his name, was still young. The boy inherited a struggling grocery operation and responsibility for supporting his family. He could have maintained the modest store his father had established, earning enough to survive but never enough to rise. William recognized that survival was not the same as success. He had grown up watching St. Louis transform into a beer city. The breweries were making men rich. The caves beneath the city were creating fortunes. William understood that the key was not simply making beer, but making the right beer for the right market. Most American breweries still produced ale using English techniques. The German immigrant population desperately wanted the lager they remembered from home, but few American brewers had mastered the temperamental fermentation process that lager demanded. In 1862, William took over his father's grocery and began brewing lager in the back room. He had learned fermentation techniques from other German brewers, had studied the science of yeast and temperature control, and most importantly, he had access to caves. His small operation could produce genuine German-style lager using natural refrigeration that gave his beer an advantage over competitors who relied on expensive ice or produced warm fermented ales. The timing was accidental genius. The Civil War had just begun. St. Louis, a border city with divided loyalties, was flooded with soldiers from both armies at various points during the conflict. Soldiers wanted beer. William could supply it. By 1864, his grocery operation had become the Western Brewery, a legitimate industrial concern occupying a full city block at the corner of Cherokee Street and Carondelet Avenue. The brewery sat directly above one of the largest accessible cave systems in St. Louis. William drilled vertical shafts through bedrock, creating a network that connected surface brewing operations to underground lagering chambers. Beer could be brewed above ground, then lowered through shafts into caves where consistent 50-degree temperatures allowed perfect fermentation. The system was efficient, expandable, and gave William a competitive advantage that other brewers could not match without similar geological luck. The Western Brewery grew rapidly. By the 1870s, it was the largest brewery in St. Louis, producing hundreds of thousands of barrels annually. By the 1890s, it would become one of the largest breweries in America, shipping beer throughout the Midwest and South via a distribution network that William built methodically, city by city, saloon by saloon. He pioneered the use of refrigerated railroad cars for beer transport, allowing him to ship long distances without spoilage. His Falstaff brand became nationally recognized, synonymous with quality German lager. William married Julia Feickert in 1861. She was the daughter of a German immigrant family that had achieved modest success in St. Louis. Together they would have 7 children, 4 sons, William Jr., who everyone called Billy, Frederick, Louis, and Charles, and 3 daughters, Hilda, Elsa, and Anna. The growing family needed a home that matched William's rising status. In the early 1870s, William purchased the DeMenil Place property from Jacob Feickert, Julia's relative. The location was strategic. The house sat within walking distance of the Western Brewery, close enough that William could oversee operations while maintaining the separation between industrial work and domestic life that wealthy families increasingly demanded. More importantly, the property sat above cave systems that connected directly to the brewery complex. William could travel to work underground if he chose, moving between his 2 worlds through limestone passages that only he controlled. The mansion was not merely a residence, it was a declaration. William J Lemp, who had started with a grocery store, now commanded an industrial empire approaching $10 million in value. The palazzo on DeMenil Place would announce that the grocer's son had arrived among St. Louis's elite. But arrival required more than purchase. It required transformation. Chapter 3. Building the Palace. William J Lemp Sr. looked at the Feickert house and saw inadequacy. The structure was solid, well-built, appropriate for a middle-class merchant. It was not appropriate for the man who controlled St. Louis's largest brewery. He needed something that would command respect from old money families who still viewed German immigrants as uncultured newcomers. He needed a palace. The transformation began shortly after purchase and continued for years. William expanded the original structure in every direction, adding rooms and floors until the modest residence had become a sprawling mansion, spreading across 3 main levels plus basement chambers and attic spaces. The final structure occupied approximately 17,000 square feet, though exact measurements varied depending on how one counted the underground portions. The architectural style remained Italian Renaissance revival, but William pushed it toward grandeur. The red brick exterior received elaborate stone trim and decorative elements. Tall windows with ornate surrounds let light flood interior spaces. The roofline became complex, featuring multiple peaks and dormers that gave the building a European palazzo profile when viewed from the street. The main entrance was remodeled with carved stone details that suggested wealth without vulgarity, power without pretension. The construction materials reflected both local sourcing and imported luxury. Brick came from St. Louis manufacturers who supplied most of the city's building projects. Decorative limestone came from Indiana quarries, known for producing stone that could be carved with fine detail. The combination created a structure that felt rooted in its location while aspiring toward European sophistication. Inside, Williams spared no expense. The entrance hall featured a massive carved wooden staircase that curved upward through multiple floors. The kind of architectural statement that announced a family's importance the moment a visitor stepped through the door. Frescoed ceilings in main rooms displayed elaborate plasterwork that required skilled Italian craftsmen to execute. Crystal chandeliers imported from Europe hung in the formal dining room and principal parlors. Hardwood floors throughout used multiple species of wood arranged in decorative patterns. The mansion's layout reflected its dual purpose as family residence and business headquarters. The main floor contained formal spaces for entertaining, multiple parlors that could be opened via pocket doors to create a continuous reception area, a dining room large enough to seat 20, a music room where the family's daughters could perform for guests, and a library lined with built-in shelving. A separate billiard room allowed the men to retire after dinner for cigars and business discussions. William's office occupied a strategic location on the main floor, positioned so he could conduct business without visitors penetrating into the family's private spaces. The room featured dark wood paneling, built-in cabinets for business records, and a substantial desk that signaled authority. This room would become the mansion's most infamous space, though William selected its finishes without knowledge of the tragedies it would witness. The upper floors contained bedrooms for family members and guests, arranged to provide privacy while maintaining the mansion's grandeur. Servants' quarters occupied portions of the top floor, separate from family spaces but within the same building, in the manner typical of urban mansions, where land scarcity prevented separate service buildings. The basement was where the mansion revealed its true uniqueness. William did not simply dig a cellar for storage. He connected the mansion's basement directly to the natural cave system beneath the property. From the basement level, passages led into limestone chambers that extended in multiple directions. Some of these passages connected to the larger cave network that ran beneath the entire neighborhood. Others had been excavated and finished specifically to create an underground connection between the mansion and the Western Brewery complex several blocks away. The tunnel system was simultaneously practical and symbolic. William could walk from his mansion to his brewery entirely underground, avoiding weather, avoiding street traffic, and most importantly, avoiding public observation. What business he conducted, who he met with, when he came and went, all of this could remain private if he chose to use the tunnels. The caves also provided perfect conditions for wine cellars and beer storage, allowing William to maintain substantial supplies at the mansion for entertaining. In 1904, William Jr., who had inherited the property after his father's death, undertook a major expansion. He added modern amenities that the original renovation had lacked: updated plumbing, improved heating systems, additional bathrooms, and other conveniences that 20th century luxury required. The expansion maintained the mansion's historical character while acknowledging that standards of comfort had evolved. The gardens surrounding the mansion received less attention than the building itself, constrained by the urban lot's limited size. Still, William ensured that formal landscaping announced the property's importance. Trees lined the approach. Decorative plantings softened the mansion's stone and brick severity. The overall effect suggested a European urban palace, a private fortress in the middle of a city that was rapidly industrializing around it. The mansion had become exactly what William intended, a throne room. The palace was complete, the underground kingdom connected to it. The dynasty was prepared to rule from this headquarters for generations. Beneath the polished floors, the caves that had made the fortune possible waited in darkness. Chapter 4. The Throne Room of St. Louis. Between the 1880s and 1901, the Lemp Mansion functioned as the nerve center of a brewing empire and the social headquarters of a family that had conquered St. Louis's industrial economy. This was the golden era. The period when everything William had built seemed invulnerable and the dynasty he was creating appeared eternal. The mansion required a staff of approximately 12 to 15 servants to maintain its operations. A butler managed the household hierarchy and supervised the other staff. Multiple cooks prepared meals for the family and handled the elaborate dinners that William and Julia hosted regularly. Housemaids cleaned the sprawling residence, a task that never ended given the scale of the property. Groundskeepers maintained the limited outdoor spaces. A laundress handled the family's clothing and the massive quantities of linens that a house of this size consumed. A coachman and stable hands managed the carriages and horses that the family used for transportation. Personal servants attended to individual family members' needs. The staff knew their roles. They understood that discretion was paramount. What happened in the Lemp Mansion stayed in the Lemp Mansion. The butler trained new hires to be invisible unless summoned, silent unless spoken to, and completely loyal to the family that employed them. William's daily routine reflected his dual role as industrialist and paterfamilias. He rose early and often traveled to the Western Brewery through the underground tunnel system, emerging in the brewery basement to begin his workday without ever appearing on a public street. He spent mornings overseeing production, meeting with foremen, reviewing distribution reports, and making the countless decisions that running a major brewery required. By afternoon, he often returned to the mansion, using his office there to conduct business that required more privacy or that involved matters beyond beer production. He managed real estate investments, negotiated with banks, met with political figures who wanted his support or feared his opposition. Julia Lemp managed the household and the family's social calendar. She directed the servants, planned meals, organized the entertaining that was essential to maintaining the family's social position, and ensured that her children received educations appropriate to their station. The daughters were sent to private schools, and in some cases, European finishing schools. The sons were groomed for eventual leadership of the family business, though it was clear from early on that Frederick was William's favorite and intended heir. The mansion served as a stage for social theater. William and Julia hosted dinners for St. Louis' business elite, events where deals were struck over brandy and cigars while the ladies retired to parlors for conversation. They held gatherings for the city's German-American community, maintaining connections to the immigrant population that formed their customer base while signaling their rise above it. They attended and hosted political fundraisers, leveraging their wealth into influence with city and state officials who regulated the brewing industry and could make life easier or harder for their operations. The entertaining followed predictable patterns. Guests arrived at the main entrance and were received in the front hall, where the grand staircase immediately impressed them. They were ushered into one of the parlors for pre-dinner drinks and conversation. When dinner was ready, pocket doors between the parlors would open and guests would move through to the formal dining room. Meals lasted hours, with multiple courses served by the household staff. After dinner, the men would often retire to the billiard room or William's office for business discussions while the ladies remained in the parlors. The pattern reinforced hierarchies of gender and status while creating opportunities for the kind of informal negotiation that built fortunes. The mansion's social significance extended beyond simple entertaining. In a city where old Yankee Protestant families still viewed German Catholic immigrants with suspicion, the Lemp Palazzo represented new money challenging established hierarchies. William could not join the most exclusive clubs or marry his daughters into the oldest families, but he could build a home that surpassed theirs in scale and luxury. The mansion was a middle finger disguised as architecture, a statement that money earned through industry was as legitimate as money inherited through land speculation or cotton trading. William also maintained a country estate called Cragwold in Kirkwood, Missouri, a wealthy suburb west of the city. The Kirkwood property provided a summer retreat and additional evidence of the family's wealth, but the DeMenil Place Mansion remained the dynasty's true headquarters. This was where William conducted the business that mattered, where the family's power was concentrated, where the next generation was being prepared to inherit an empire. The children grew up surrounded by luxury, but also by expectation. Billy, the eldest son, was sociable and enjoyed the privileges wealth provided. Frederick, younger but favored, showed the seriousness and business acumen that William valued. Louis and Charles were quieter, less ambitious, content to benefit from their father's success without driving themselves towards similar achievement. The daughters navigated the complex social requirements that wealthy women faced, preparing for marriages that would cement alliances and produce grandchildren to continue the dynasty. Behind the opulence and entertaining, the mansion also facilitated activities that required discretion. William met with political figures to discuss regulatory matters that could affect his business. He negotiated with other brewers about market territory and pricing, discussions that sometimes veered into arrangements that antitrust laws would later prohibit. He managed relationships with suppliers, distributors, and saloon owners who sold his beer, relationships that involved cash payments and favors that would not bear public scrutiny. The mansion's privacy protected these transactions. The tunnel system allowed people to come and go without being observed from the street. The office where William conducted his most sensitive business became a sanctuary. Heavy doors could be closed. Conversations could not be overheard from other parts of the house. When William needed to make difficult decisions or handle problematic situations, this was where he retreated. The room would absorb his triumphs and his worries, his ambitions and his fears. The mansion stood at its peak during these years. The brewery was producing over 500,000 barrels annually. The Falstaff brand was known across the country. William's personal fortune continued climbing toward $10 million. The family's position in St. Louis society, while never fully accepted by old money, was secure enough that their wealth commanded respect, even from those who disdained German beer makers. But the dynasty William was building rested on one fragile pillar: his favored son, Frederick, who was already dying. Chapter 5. The First Death. The golden era shattered in December of 1901. Frederick Lemp, 28 years old, died suddenly of heart failure at the family's country estate in Kirkwood. The death was unexpected, shocking, and for William J Lemp Sr., catastrophic in a way that transcended normal grief. Frederick had been the chosen one. Among William's 4 sons, Frederick showed the combination of intelligence, business sense, and drive that William recognized as essential for leading the brewery empire into the 20th century. Billy was social, but lacked Frederick's focus. Louis and Charles were pleasant, but uninspiring. Frederick understood the business. He asked the right questions. He saw opportunities that others missed. William had been grooming him for succession, gradually transferring responsibility and knowledge, preparing him to take control when William eventually stepped aside or died. That future evaporated with Frederick's heart. William's response to the death was immediate and total psychological collapse. He fell into a depression so severe that it alarmed his family and business associates. He withdrew from social activities. His involvement in brewery operations became sporadic and unreliable. He spent increasing amounts of time alone in his office, the room where he had made the decisions that built his fortune. Now a cave where he mourned the son who was supposed to inherit it. The mansion's atmosphere transformed. The entertaining stopped. The social calendar went blank. Julia tried to maintain normalcy, but the center had fallen out of the household. William's grief contaminated every room. Servants moved through their duties in silence, uncertain how to behave around a patriarch whose will had always driven the institution and who now seemed interested only in his sorrow. Friends and business partners tried to console William. They reminded him he had other sons, other children, a wife, a business empire that still needed his leadership. Their words meant nothing. William had not simply lost a son, he had lost the future he had been building. Frederick's death revealed the fragility of dynastic ambition. You could build an empire, accumulate millions, construct palaces, but death could destroy your plans with a single heartbeat's failure. William's physical health deteriorated along with his mental state. He aged rapidly. The energetic industrialist who had built the Western Brewery into a national power became an old man shuffling through empty rooms, haunted by what should have been. On February 13th, 1904, William J. Lemp Sr. walked into his office on the mansion's main floor, closed the heavy wooden door, and shot himself in the head. He was 67 years old. His body was discovered by household staff who had heard the gunshot but had not immediately entered, trained as they were to respect the patriarch's privacy, even in death. The suicide devastated St. Louis. William had been one of the city's industrial titans, a self-made millionaire who embodied immigrant success. His death by his own hand suggested that even spectacular wealth could not insulate a man from psychological pain. The funeral was massive, drawing thousands of mourners from across the city and region. Newspapers covered the death extensively, though they treated the suicide with the delicacy that prominent families commanded in that era, describing William's action as the result of despondency following illness. The estate was valued at the fortune his father had spent a lifetime building. It was divided among William's surviving children, with the brewery operations and the DeMenil Place mansion passing to his eldest son, William J Lemp Jr., Billy. Billy inherited the empire his father had built, the mansion where his father had lived, and the office where his father's blood had stained the floor. He also inherited something less tangible, but perhaps more dangerous: the family's emerging pattern of responding to disappointment with bullets rather than endurance. The brewery passed to new hands. The mansion had absorbed its first suicide. The dynasty would continue. For now. Chapter 6. Billy's Kingdom and the Empire's Peak. William J Lemp Jr. took control of his father's empire at a complicated moment. The brewery was enormously profitable, producing over 500,000 barrels annually and generating revenue that sustained the family's luxurious lifestyle. But Billy was not Frederick. He lacked his dead brother's business instincts and his father's relentless drive. What Billy possessed instead was charm, social grace, and a genuine enjoyment of the privileges that wealth provided. He was, in many ways, exactly the kind of heir that dooms dynasties. Not incompetent enough to destroy the business immediately, but not talented enough to adapt when circumstances changed. Billy moved into the DeMenil Place mansion and immediately set about making it his own. In 1904, the same year he inherited, he undertook a major expansion of the property. He added modern amenities that his father's generation had considered unnecessary luxuries: improved heating systems, additional bathrooms with the latest plumbing fixtures, updated electrical wiring, and other conveniences that reflected early 20th century standards of comfort. The expansion maintained the mansion's historical character, while acknowledging that expectations of luxury had evolved since the 1870s. Billy married Lillian Lemp, known as Lily, in a society wedding that announced the new generation's arrival. Lily came from another prominent St. Louis family and brought social connections that complemented Billy's wealth. Together they transformed the mansion into a center of social activity that would have exhausted William Sr., who had viewed entertaining primarily as a business necessity. Billy and Lily enjoyed throwing parties. They hosted dinners, balls, and gatherings that filled the rooms with laughter and music and champagne. The Western Brewery continued to thrive under Billy's management, though management might be too generous a term for his involvement. Billy had inherited a well-oiled machine built by his father and staffed by experienced brewmasters and managers who knew their jobs. Billy's primary contribution was not interfering with their work and ensuring the money kept flowing. The Falstaff brand remained nationally recognized. Distribution networks continued to expand. Profits rolled in steadily. Billy lived the life that wealth promised. He collected art. He traveled to Europe. He entertained St. Louis society with a generosity that won him friends and social prestige. He used the mansion as his father had intended, as a throne room. But Billy's court was more focused on pleasure than power. The mansion during Billy's ownership represented the brewery empire at its absolute peak. The business was printing money. The family name commanded respect. The social calendar overflowed with engagements. If you had walked through the rooms in 1915, you would have seen crystal chandeliers blazing, heard string quartets playing in the music room, watched society ladies in silk gowns moving through parlors decorated with European furnishings, and concluded that the Lemp dynasty was invincible. You would have been catastrophically wrong. Warning signs existed, but Billy ignored them or failed to recognize their significance. The temperance movement, which had been a fringe concern during William Sr.'s era, was growing louder and more politically powerful. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League were winning converts across the country, particularly in rural areas where Protestant fundamentalism viewed alcohol as sin incarnate. State after state was enacting prohibition laws. Politicians who had once relied on brewery money were distancing themselves from the industry as temperance voters became too numerous to ignore. Billy's personal life also showed cracks beneath the glamorous surface. His marriage to Lily deteriorated as he conducted affairs that became increasingly public. St. Louis society, which tolerated discreet infidelity, began to whisper about Billy's behavior. Lily's unhappiness became obvious to anyone who attended their parties and watched the couple maintain polite distance while hosting guests in their palace. In 1918, as World War I raged in Europe and American soldiers died in French trenches, the temperance movement achieved its greatest political victory. Congress passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States. The amendment required ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures, a threshold that seemed challenging but achievable given the movement's momentum. Billy watched the political process with growing alarm but seemed unable to believe that the government would actually destroy an entire industry that employed hundreds of thousands of workers and generated enormous tax revenue. Surely reason would prevail. Surely politicians would recognize that prohibition was unenforceable and economically catastrophic. Surely America would not actually do something this insane. On January 16, 1919, the necessary number of states ratified the 18th Amendment. Prohibition was now constitutional law, scheduled to take effect 1 year later. Billy stood at the peak, commanding the empire his father had built, the mansion at its most magnificent, the brewery at maximum production. Then the United States government destroyed everything with a single constitutional amendment. Chapter 7. The empire collapses. The 18th Amendment took effect on January 16, 1920. Overnight, the Western Brewery's core business became illegal. The production, sale, and distribution of beer, the activity that had generated the Lemp fortune, was now a federal crime punishable by fines and imprisonment. The impact was immediate and total. The brewery, which had been producing over 500,000 barrels annually, could no longer legally make the product it had perfected over 60 years. The distribution network that William Sr. had built city by city across the Midwest and South became worthless. The Falstaff brand that had been nationally recognized became a memory. The caves beneath St. Louis that had given the brewery its competitive advantage sat empty and silent, their perfect lagering temperatures useless when lagering was criminal. Billy tried desperately to save the business. He pivoted to producing near beer, the low-alcohol beverage that prohibition laws technically allowed. Near beer was beer that had been brewed normally, then had most of its alcohol removed through a secondary process. The resulting product tasted vaguely beer-like, but satisfied no one. Real beer drinkers wanted actual beer, which they could now obtain only through illegal bootleggers. Teetotalers who supported prohibition were not interested in a product that still reminded them of the vice they had successfully banned. The near-beer gambit failed spectacularly. Sales barely covered production costs. The massive brewery complex that had been designed to produce hundreds of thousands of barrels of real beer could not economically retool for a product that no one wanted. The workforce that had numbered in the hundreds was laid off in waves as production areas shut down. By 1920, 2 years after Prohibition began, Billy was forced to close the Western Brewery permanently. The complex that William Sr. had built and expanded over decades went dark. The equipment that had produced some of America's finest lager sat idle. The caves beneath the property, which had refrigerated beer for 3 generations of St. Louis drinkers, became tombs for a dead industry. Billy's personal life collapsed in parallel with the business. His marriage to Lily, already strained by his infidelities and her unhappiness, finally disintegrated. They divorced, a scandalous step in an era when divorce still carried social stigma, particularly among Catholic families like the Lemps. The society friends who had filled the mansion during the prosperous years became noticeably scarce as Billy's wealth disappeared and his social position crumbled. The mansion itself began to feel different. The entertaining stopped because Billy could no longer afford it, and because no one wanted to attend parties thrown by a bankrupt beer baron. Servants were let go as operating budgets tightened. Rooms that had been continuously occupied and meticulously maintained were closed off to save on heating and cleaning costs. The palace that had announced the family's arrival began to echo with absence. Billy spent increasing amounts of time in the office where his father had killed himself. He sat at the same desk where William Sr. had sat, staring at the same walls, contemplating the same kind of failure. William Sr. had lost a son and lost his will to continue. Billy was losing the empire his father had built, watching 60 years of work dissolve, because the American government had decided that morality mattered more than industry. In 1922, Billy made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. He sold the Western Brewery complex, the buildings, the equipment, the caves, the land, the Falstaff brand name, everything his father had created, for $588,000. The brewery had been worth approximately $7 million before Prohibition. Billy sold it for less than 10% of its value. The loss represented a 92% destruction of wealth in less than 3 years. The buyer was the International Shoe Company, which planned to convert the brewery buildings into a shoe factory. The caves that had lagered beer for generations would now store leather and rubber. The spaces where William Sr. had built his fortune would make shoes. The humiliation was complete. On December 29, 1922, William J Lemp Jr. walked into his office in the DeMenil Place mansion, the same office where his father had died 18 years earlier, and shot himself in the chest. He was 52 years old. He left a brief note expressing his despair, though the exact contents were never made public. The discovery followed the same pattern as his father's death. Household staff heard the gunshot, but did not immediately enter the office. When they finally broke through the door, they found Billy slumped at the desk where William Sr. had conducted the business that built the dynasty and where William Sr. had ended his life when that dynasty's future seemed to die with Frederick. 2 men, 1 office, 2 suicides, 18 years apart. St. Louis reacted with less shock this time. The first Lemp suicide had been tragic. The second seemed almost inevitable. The family was cursed, people said. The brewery's destruction had broken Billy's spirit just as Frederick's death had broken his father's. The Lemps could not endure disappointment. They chose bullets over perseverance. The mansion passed to Billy's brother, Charles A Lemp, who inherited a palace built for celebrating that had become a mausoleum. The dynasty that had seemed eternal had lasted exactly 1 generation beyond its founder. Chapter 8. The Hermit in the Palace. Charles A. Lemp had always been the quiet brother, the one who never sought attention or showed ambition to lead the family business. While Billy had been sociable and Frederick had been driven, Charles had been content to benefit from his father's fortune without pursuing his own. He never married. He formed few close relationships. When he inherited the DeMenil Place mansion in 1922 after Billy's suicide, he was already in his 50s, already set in patterns of solitude that would define the next 27 years. Charles moved into the mansion and lived there alone. Not entirely alone initially. He maintained a minimal household staff, a cook, perhaps a housekeeper, someone to handle basic maintenance. But Charles had no interest in entertaining, no social calendar to manage, no business empire to run from the office. He closed off most of the rooms, heating and maintaining only the spaces he actually used, the parlors where William Sr. and Billy had hosted St. Louis society sat empty, furniture covered with sheets, chandeliers dark. The music room where the family's daughters had once performed fell silent. The billiard room where men had made deals over cigars and brandy became a storage area for items Charles did not want, but could not bring himself to discard. Charles established a routine that varied little over the decades. He rose late, took meals in whichever room suited his mood, and spent his days reading, managing what remained of the family investments, and avoiding human contact. He ventured outside rarely. When he needed supplies or services, he sent staff to handle it, rather than appearing in public himself. He became a ghost in his own house, a hermit in a palace built for crowds. The mansion decayed around him. Charles lacked his father's drive to maintain the property and lacked the income to afford proper upkeep, even if he had cared. Roofs began to leak. Plaster cracked and fell. Wallpaper peeled. Paint faded. The gardens that had once announced the family's importance grew wild and then died from neglect. The mansion that had been meticulously maintained by a full staff of servants now received only the minimal attention that Charles's reduced household could provide. The Depression arrived in 1929 and ground through the 1930s, but Charles barely noticed. He had enough money from the remnants of the family fortune to survive, and survival was all he sought. The world outside transformed. Radio, then movies, then the approach of another world war. But Charles remained unchanged inside his decaying palace, aging in isolation. The isolation was not entirely unusual for the era. Many wealthy families had spinster daughters or bachelor sons who lived alone in family properties, maintained by trust funds, slowly withdrawing from a world they found increasingly foreign. Charles fit this pattern, though the scale of his isolation was more extreme than most. Dozens of rooms for one man, servants who came and went but never penetrated his solitude, days that blended into years without variation or purpose. Charles's only consistent companion in his final years was his dog. The animal's breed and name are lost to history, but witnesses who occasionally saw Charles reported that he doted on the dog with an affection he showed no human. The dog accompanied him through the mansion's empty rooms, slept near his bed, received the best food Charles could provide. For a man who had rejected human connection, the dog represented the only relationship he could tolerate. By the late 1940s, Charles was in his mid-70s, his health declining, his loneliness absolute. He had outlived his parents, his brothers Frederick and Billy, his sister Elsa, who had also died by suicide in 1920. He had outlived the brewery empire. He had outlived the dynasty his father had tried to create. He was the last Lemp living in the mansion that William Sr. had built to house generations of family glory. On May 10, 1949, Charles A. Lemp walked down to the mansion's basement, the level that connected to the cave system his grandfather had used to build a fortune, and made his final decision. He shot his dog first. He could not leave the animal alone. He could not trust that anyone else would care for it properly. Better to kill it himself than abandon it to uncertain fate. Then he shot himself. He was 77 years old. He had never married, never fathered children, never built anything, never left a mark on the world beyond occupying space in a decaying mansion for 27 years. His body was not discovered for several days, which surprised no one given how completely he had withdrawn from human society. Charles's death brought the Lemp family suicides to 4 across 45 years. William Sr. in 1904, Elsa in 1920, Billy in 1922, Charles in 1949. The mansion built to celebrate a dynasty had become a tomb for a family that could not survive disappointment. The estate that Charles left was a fraction of what his father had accumulated. Most of the brewery wealth had been lost to Prohibition and the catastrophic sale of the Western Brewery. What remained was divided among distant relatives and descendants of Charles's siblings. None of them wanted the mansion. In 1949, the DeMenil Place property was sold at public auction. The palazzo that had cost a fortune to build and maintain, that had housed one of St. Louis's wealthiest families, that had witnessed 4 suicides, sold for approximately $10,000. The dynasty William Sr. had tried to create was extinguished. William Sr.'s palace was about to sell for less than a decent automobile. Chapter 9. The Fall. The numbers tell the story of collapse more efficiently than any narrative. In 1904, when William J Lemp Sr. died, the family estate was worth the fortune that 3 generations could not imagine spending. In 1949, when the mansion sold at auction after Charles's death, it brought $10,000. A property that had represented the peak of industrial wealth had been devalued by 99.9% in 45 years. The buyer in 1949 did not purchase a palace. He purchased a problem. The mansion required extensive repairs that decades of deferred maintenance under Charles's ownership had made urgent. Roofs leaked, plaster was falling, electrical systems were outdated and dangerous. Plumbing failed regularly. The gardens had died. The outbuildings had collapsed or been demolished. The property was sound structurally, but deteriorating rapidly in every other way. The new owner had no interest in restoring the mansion to its former glory. Restoration would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars with no prospect of return on investment. The neighborhood around DeMenil Place was declining as St. Louis's urban core began the long decay that would characterize mid-century American cities. Wealthy families were fleeing to suburbs. The mansion's location, once prestigious, was becoming a liability. The buyer saw a different opportunity. He would convert the mansion into a boarding house, dividing the rooms into 15 to 20 small rental units that could generate steady income from working-class tenants who needed cheap housing close to industrial jobs. The conversion destroyed the mansion's original configuration. Walls were erected to partition the large formal spaces into multiple small rooms. Bathrooms were installed throughout, cutting into original rooms to create the plumbing infrastructure that individual rental units required. Kitchenettes appeared in spaces that had once been servants' quarters or storage areas. The grand parlors where William Sr. had hosted St. Louis elite were carved into 4 or 5 separate apartments. The music room became 3 bedrooms. The library vanished entirely behind new construction. Original features that made the mansion valuable were ripped out and sold. Crystal chandeliers disappeared. Decorative plasterwork was painted over or removed. Built-in cabinetry was torn out to maximize rentable floor space. Pocket doors between parlors were either removed or nailed permanently closed. Hardwood floors were covered with cheap linoleum. The carved wooden staircase remained because removing it would have been structurally dangerous, but it was painted in industrial colors that covered the wood's original finish. The boarding house opened for business sometime in the early 1950s. It attracted exactly the tenants such properties always attract: workers who could not afford better housing, transient individuals moving through St. Louis, people who asked no questions and expected no amenities beyond a door that locked and a roof that mostly did not leak. The boarding house era lasted approximately 25 years. During that time, the mansion passed through multiple owners, each extracting rent while investing nothing in maintenance. The property was a cash cow that you milked until it died, then sold to someone else who would milk it further. No owner had incentive to preserve historical character or maintain quality. The tenants had no investment in the property's condition. Damage accumulated. By the early 1970s, the mansion was catastrophically deteriorated. The roof had developed significant holes that allowed rain to pour into upper floors, causing water damage that spread through ceilings and walls. Standing water destroyed plaster. Mold grew in corners and closets. The beautiful frescoed ceilings that Italian craftsmen had created were stained and crumbling. Structural concerns emerged as water damage undermined support beams. Windows were broken and boarded rather than repaired. The heating system failed repeatedly. Electrical wiring, never properly updated when the building was subdivided, created fire hazards. Original furnishings that might have remained during the boarding house conversion were stolen, vandalized, or simply thrown away when they became inconvenient. The few architectural features that survived: portions of the staircase, some of the original woodwork, bore decades of abuse from tenants who treated them as disposable rather than valuable. The neighborhood continued its decline. Buildings around the mansion were abandoned or converted to industrial use. Crime increased. Property values plummeted. The DeMenil Place area, which had been among St. Louis's most fashionable addresses in the 1880s, had become a marginal neighborhood where developers saw only blight. Demolition was proposed multiple times during this period. Real estate speculators looked at the mansion and saw valuable corner lot wasted on a deteriorating structure that was becoming dangerous. They filed permits to demolish the building and construct something profitable: a parking lot, a small commercial building, modern apartments. Each time the demolition permit stalled, not because anyone wanted to preserve the mansion, but because tearing down a structure that large was expensive, and the land value did not justify the investment. The mansion survived through malign neglect. It was too expensive to demolish, too deteriorated to attract serious buyers, and just profitable enough as a slum boarding house that owners kept it limping along. No preservation organization rallied to save it. Historic preservation as a movement existed in the 1970s, but it focused on colonial-era buildings and architecturally significant landmarks. A Victorian mansion built by German beer barons did not trigger preservation instincts. The building's history of suicides, rather than making it notable, made it undesirable. By 1975, the mansion was approaching the point where collapse might occur naturally. The roof would fail completely. Water damage would undermine the structure. The building would become unsafe for occupancy. The city would condemn it. Then demolition would happen not through development pressure, but through simple surrender to gravity and time. The mansion stood at its lowest point, gutted. A town, damaged, despised, scheduled for oblivion through either deliberate demolition or passive collapse. Then two people who had no business attempting such madness decided to try. Chapter 10. The Rescuers. In 1975, Paul and Patty Pointer were looking for a building. Their backgrounds and motivations remain somewhat obscure in available records. But what is clear is that they wanted to open a restaurant, and they needed a property with character, something distinctive enough to attract customers in a competitive market. When they learned that the former Lemp Mansion was available for $30,000, approximately $170,000 in modern currency, they arranged a viewing. What they found was catastrophic. The roof had holes large enough to see sky through. Rain had been pouring into the upper floors for years, creating water damage that spread throughout the structure. Plaster hung from ceilings in sheets, or had fallen entirely, exposing the lath underneath. The boarding house partitions that carved up the original rooms were shabby construction, walls that blocked sight lines and destroyed the mansion's flow without adding any structural value. Linoleum covered the hardwood floors, cracked and filthy from decades of neglect. Windows were broken. The heating system was barely functional. Electrical wiring was a fire waiting for a spark. The gardens had vanished entirely, replaced by bare dirt and weeds. The exterior brick needed repointing. Stone trim was crumbling. The once grand entrance looked decrepit and dangerous. The property was not a mansion. It was a disaster. Paul and Patty could have walked away. Most rational people would have. The building needed hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs just to become habitable, and that was before any thought of restoration to historical appearance. The location was in a declining neighborhood with limited commercial traffic. The building's history of suicides would repel many potential customers rather than attract them. They decided to buy it anyway. The decision required either extraordinary vision or impressive delusion, possibly both. The Pointers purchased the property and immediately moved in, living in the wreckage while they worked to stabilize the structure. They could not afford to hire contractors for most of the work. They would have to do it themselves, learning construction and restoration techniques through trial and error. The first priority was the roof. Nothing else mattered if rain continued destroying the interior. They scraped together money for emergency roof repairs, patching the worst holes and creating enough weather protection to stop the immediate damage. Then they began the slow process of working through the building room by room, removing the boarding house modifications and attempting to reveal what remained of the original mansion beneath decades of abuse. They tore out the partitions that divided the formal parlors. exposing the original floor plan. They discovered that much of the original woodwork still existed under layers of paint. They found sections of the frescoed ceilings that could be saved. They uncovered fireplaces that had been sealed shut. The mansion was revealing itself as they stripped away the boarding house era, showing them what William Lemp Sr. had built beneath what 75 years of neglect had hidden. But revelation did not mean restoration. The Pointers lacked the expertise and funds for proper historical restoration. They made practical decisions rather than purist ones. Where original plaster could not be saved, they installed modern drywall. Where original fixtures were missing, they found period-appropriate replacements rather than expensive exact recreations. Where historical accuracy would have cost thousands, they accepted sympathetic approximation that cost hundreds. The work consumed years. The Pointers lived in construction chaos, breathing plaster dust, working exhausting hours, watching their personal finances drain into a building that might never generate return on their investment. But slowly, the mansion began to function again as a building rather than a wreck. In 1977, they made a critical decision. They would open the property as a restaurant before completing the full restoration. The restaurant revenue could fund continued work on the building. The alternative was running out of money and losing everything they had already invested. They prepared the main floor for commercial food service, installing a kitchen in a location that approximated where kitchens had been during the mansion's residential era. They restored several of the formal dining rooms to create restaurant seating. They ensured the building met health department codes and obtained the necessary permits and licenses. They hired a small staff. The Lemp Mansion Restaurant opened in 1977. The initial challenge was attracting customers to a location in a declining neighborhood, in a building with a dark history, operated by owners with no restaurant industry experience. The Pointers needed a marketing angle that would make people willing to drive to DeMenil Place despite its reputation. They found that angle in the building's history of suicides. Rather than downplaying the deaths, they emphasized them. The restaurant offered not just food, but atmosphere. You could eat dinner in the mansion where the Lemp family had killed themselves. You could sit in rooms where tragedies had occurred. The Pointers began offering ghost tours in addition to restaurant service, telling the stories of William Sr.'s suicide, Billy's suicide, Charles's suicide, the family's curse. They invited paranormal investigation groups to explore the building. The approach was controversial. Historical preservationists argued that sensationalizing suicides was exploitative and disrespectful to the dead. Mental health advocates worried that treating suicide as entertainment could glorify or romanticize it. Descendants of the Lemp family had mixed reactions, some appreciating that the building was being saved while others uncomfortable with how their family's tragedies were being marketed. But the strategy worked commercially. The haunted angle drew customers. People made reservations weeks in advance to eat in the allegedly haunted mansion. Ghost tour tickets sold steadily. The restaurant generated enough revenue to keep operating and to fund continued restoration work. In the 1980s, the Pointers added bed and breakfast accommodations on the upper floors. They restored 4 to 5 bedrooms as guest rooms, installing modern bathrooms while maintaining period furnishings and decor. Guests could now sleep in the Lemp Mansion, an experience that paranormal enthusiasts found irresistible. The B&B added another revenue stream that supported preservation efforts. The Pointers had discovered that salvation required compromise. Wealth's monument now served dinner to strangers, and the suicides that had cursed the family had become paradoxically the reason anyone cared enough to save the building. Chapter 11. The Haunted Palace. By the 1990s, the Lemp Mansion had developed a reputation that extended far beyond St. Louis. It had become one of America's most famous allegedly haunted buildings, a destination for paranormal enthusiasts, and a subject of investigation by ghost-hunting television shows. The transformation from boarding house wreck to haunted tourism attraction was complete. The haunted reputation rested on the building's documented history. 4 family suicides were undeniable facts. William Sr. shooting himself in his office was recorded in newspapers and death certificates. Billy killing himself in the same office 18 years later was similarly documented. Elsa's suicide in her own home added a 3rd family death. Charles shooting his dog, then himself in the basement, completed the tragic count. These were not legends or folklore. These deaths happened. What transformed documented tragedy into alleged haunting was the decision to interpret unexplained phenomena as supernatural rather than structural. Old buildings make sounds as temperatures change and materials expand or contract. The Lemp Mansion, with its extensive underground connection to cave systems, had unusual acoustics that could amplify sounds in unexpected ways. Windows rattled. Doors that had swelled from moisture would not close properly. Floorboards creaked. The heating system produced mysterious noises. All of this was normal in a structure built in the 1860s and imperfectly maintained. But normal did not sell ghost tours. The Pointers and their staff learned to interpret these ordinary building behaviors as potential paranormal activity. A door that would not stay closed became the ghost of Charles Lemp wandering the halls. Sounds from the basement were William Sr.'s restless spirit. Cold spots near windows became supernatural presences rather than poor insulation. The mansion's quirks became evidence of haunting. Paranormal investigation groups began visiting regularly, bringing equipment designed to detect electromagnetic fields, temperature variations, and other phenomena that they interpreted as ghost activity. The groups reported positive results, finding anomalies that they attributed to supernatural presence. Whether these anomalies were actually evidence of anything beyond confirmation bias and equipment malfunction was debatable. But the reports generated publicity that drew more visitors. Television shows dedicated to ghost hunting filmed episodes at the Lemp Mansion. Programs like Ghost Adventures and Ghost Hunters featured the property, their hosts wandering through darkened rooms with infrared cameras and EMF detectors, declaring that they sensed presences and captured evidence of paranormal activity. The shows reached millions of viewers and cemented the mansion's status as a haunted destination. The controversy about this approach never fully resolved. Historical preservationists appreciated that the Pointers had saved a building that would otherwise have been demolished. They acknowledged that adaptive reuse as a restaurant and inn was a legitimate preservation strategy, particularly for a property that lacked government protection or funding. But many preservationists were uncomfortable with the heavy emphasis on ghost stories over actual history. The mansion had genuine architectural significance as an example of 1860s Italian Renaissance revival urban architecture. It had historical importance as the headquarters of a brewing dynasty that reflected St. Louis's German immigrant community and industrial development. Reducing the building to the place where people killed themselves seemed to trivialize its broader cultural value. Mental health advocates raised different concerns. The United States has a serious suicide problem. Approximately 45,000 Americans die by suicide annually. Treating suicide as entertainment, as something spooky or supernatural rather than as a public health crisis rooted in mental illness, could normalize or romanticize it. The Lemp family's 4 suicides across 45 years suggested possible genetic predisposition to depression or other mental health conditions that ran in families. Understanding the deaths through that lens could be educational. Treating them as ghost story fodder was potentially harmful. The Pointer family defended their approach on practical grounds. The building had been on the verge of demolition when they purchased it. No preservation organization had stepped forward to save it. No government entity had protected it. The Pointers had risked their personal finances to rescue the property, and they had succeeded by creating a business model that generated enough revenue to sustain preservation. If emphasizing the haunted angle drew customers who funded restoration work, then the approach was justified regardless of how historians felt about it. The defense had merit. Preservation requires money. Historical accuracy and architectural significance do not pay utility bills or roof repairs. The Pointers found a revenue source that worked, and the mansion survived because of it. Whether that survival came at the cost of dignity or historical integrity was a philosophical question that had no definitive answer. The current operations reflect the compromise between commercial necessity and historical responsibility. The restaurant serves quality food in dining rooms restored to approximate their historical appearance. The ghost tours discuss the actual history of the suicides alongside the paranormal claims, giving visitors both documented facts and alleged supernatural phenomena. The bed and breakfast rooms feature period-appropriate furnishings that suggest what the mansion looked like during its residential era. Visitors who come for ghosts leave with some understanding of the Lemp family's actual story. Visitors who come for history tolerate the ghost stories as the price of admission. The mansion's physical condition today is the best it has been since Charles Lemp's death in 1949. The roof is sound. The major systems work. The rooms that are open to the public have been restored to functional historical appearance, even if not perfect historical accuracy. Ongoing maintenance continues as funds allow. The building is not pristine, but it is stable and preserved in a way that seemed impossible in 1975. Patty Pointer continues to operate the mansion with family members including Dick Pointer, maintaining the business that has sustained the property for nearly 50 years. The question of what happens when the current generation ages and potentially sells or transfers ownership remains unanswered. The mansion has no formal historic designation that would legally protect it from demolition or radical alteration. Its survival depends on continued commercial viability and on owners who choose to maintain it. The neighborhood around the mansion has improved as St. Louis undergoes selective urban revitalization. The area is no longer the declining district it was in the 1970s. New development nearby has increased property values. The mansion is now viewed as an asset rather than blight, a tourist destination that brings visitors to the neighborhood. The improved context makes the building's long-term survival more likely, though not guaranteed. The Lemp Mansion stands today at 3,322 DeMenil Place, exactly where it has stood since Jacob Feickert built it in 1868. The red brick has weathered but remains intact. The stone trim shows its age but continues to ornament the facade. The rooms that William J Lemp Sr filled with luxury and Dynasty building now host strangers who eat dinner and sleep in beds and take photographs for social media. The building is a monument to multiple histories simultaneously, and those histories often contradict each other. It is a monument to immigrant ambition. William Sr. arrived in America as a toddler, the son of a grocer, and died controlling a brewing empire. The mansion he built announced that German immigrants could rise as high as anyone in American society, that industry and innovation could generate wealth equal to old money's land speculation and inheritance. The palazzo on DeMenil Place proved that a grocer's son could live like royalty. But the mansion is also a monument to the fragility of dynastic ambition. William Sr. built an empire designed to last generations. It barely survived his own death. His son Frederick, the chosen heir, died before inheriting anything. His son Billy destroyed the business within 3 years of Prohibition. The dynasty that was supposed to rule St. Louis brewing for centuries extinguished itself in 45 years. The mansion built to house a multi-generational empire watched that empire disintegrate in a single lifetime. It is a monument to American industrial history. The brewing industry made St. Louis wealthy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Lemp Brewery was among the largest and most successful, a model of German immigrant entrepreneurship and technical innovation. The mansion represents the golden age of American brewing, when beer was king and the men who made it lived like emperors. That world ended with Prohibition, and the mansion absorbed that ending, watching the industry die and the fortunes evaporate. But the mansion is also a monument to government's power to destroy entire industries through legislation. The 18th Amendment did not merely inconvenience the Lemps, it destroyed them. A constitutional change eliminated the business model that had generated the family fortune. No amount of hard work or innovation could overcome a law that made the product illegal. The mansion became a memorial to the thousands of American brewers who lost everything when morality legislation killed their livelihoods. It is a monument to mental health and generational trauma. 4 family suicides across 45 years suggest something deeper than bad luck or weak character. Depression runs in families. The Lemps may have inherited genetic predisposition to mental illness along with their wealth. Frederick's unexpected death devastated William Sr. so completely that he could not recover. Billy's failure to save the brewery from Prohibition broke him as completely as Frederick's death broke his father. Charles withdrew from the world entirely, living alone for decades before killing his dog and himself. The mansion witnessed a family that could not endure disappointment, that chose bullets over perseverance, that lacked whatever psychological resilience allows people to survive tragedy and continue living. But the mansion is also a monument to the limits of wealth as protection against pain. The Lemps had everything money could buy: a palace, servants, social position, comfort, security. None of it mattered when Frederick died. None of it prevented Prohibition. None of it made Charles any less lonely. The mansion proved that you could have millions and still be vulnerable to heartbreak, failure, and despair. Wealth bought luxury, but not immunity. It is a monument to preservation through compromise. The Pointers saved a building that no one else wanted to save. They invested their own money and decades of labor. They created a business model that generated revenue sufficient to sustain preservation. The mansion survived because of them. But the price of survival was commercialization. The Dynasty's headquarters became a restaurant. The throne room became a dining room. The suicides became marketing. Whether that represents pragmatic preservation or exploitation of tragedy depends on your perspective, and both perspectives have merit. The mansion today operates as Lemp Mansion Restaurant and Inn. Reservations are recommended for the restaurant. Ghost tours are offered regularly. Bed and breakfast accommodations can be booked online. The property is privately owned but open to the public through commercial operations. You can visit, eat dinner, sleep in the rooms where the Lemps lived, walk through spaces where 4 people ended their lives. The experience is simultaneously authentic and artificial. The building is real, the history documented, the architecture genuine. But the presentation is necessarily theatrical. You cannot fully separate the historical mansion from the haunted house attraction. The Pointers have created something that is neither purely historical preservation nor purely commercial entertainment, but rather a hybrid that allows both to exist in the same space. The walls still stand, bearing witness to everything they have absorbed. They remember William Sr.'s ambition and Frederick's death. They remember Billy's parties and his bankruptcy. They remember Charles's isolation and his final gunshot. They remember the boarding house tenants who carved the mansion into slum apartments. They remember the Pointers arriving to find a wreck and deciding to attempt rescue. The mansion that William J Lemp Sr. built to announce his arrival has become a monument to his family's departure. The dynasty he tried to create died with his grandchildren. The brewery he built was sold for scrap. The fortune he accumulated dispersed to distant relatives who never lived in the mansion and have no connection to the story. What survives is the building itself, filled now with strangers who know the Lemp name only because of how the family died, rather than how they lived. The dynasty's headquarters now makes money by serving meals to tourists. The office where 2 men shot themselves is now a stop on ghost tours. The basement where Charles killed his dog and himself is now a space where paranormal investigators set up cameras hoping to capture evidence of spirits. The mansion proves that buildings outlast their builders and that survival requires adaptation. It demonstrates that history gets remembered the way the present needs to remember it. The Lemps wanted to be remembered as brewing titans who built an empire. They are remembered instead as the cursed family that kept killing themselves. The irony would have devastated William Sr., but the walls do not care about irony. They simply stand, red brick, weathered but intact, filled with people who are not Lemps, still bearing witness, still refusing to forget. Monuments to ambition and failure, wealth and despair, preserved not as the family intended, but preserved nonetheless, still standing at 3,322 DeMenil Place after more than 150 years.